Hello, I'm John Jacob, former president of the National Urban League and honorary chair of LEAD InterGenerational Solutions, Inc. LEAD was founded by my good friend, Dr. Janet Deward-Bell, whom I met some years ago when she was a young Washington Urban League 30 years and under board member. Over the years, I have been a promoter of intergenerational learning and cooperation. So it is indeed gratifying that this notion is finally taking root, because it is very much needed for such a time as this.
I'm Janet Deward-Bell, and I'd like to welcome you to Race, Rights, Righteous Anger, Redemption, and Hope, the Intergenerational Path Forward, presented by LEAD InterGenerational Solutions. LEAD was founded in 2017. Our moderator today is the legendary television anchor and reporter Carol Jenkins. Born in Montgomery, Alabama, she became, in 1970, one of the first African-American anchors at a major television station, WNBC in New York City. Among her many career highlights is an eyewitness report from South Africa on Nelson Mandela's release from prison. She later hosted a daily talk show and is today the host of Black America on CUNY television. With her daughter, Elizabeth Gardner-Hines, she co-authored Black Titan, A.G. Gaston, and the Making of a Black Millionaire, the story of her uncle. A.G. Gaston provided critical financial support to the civil rights movement. Carol is co-president and CEO of the ERA Coalition.
Well, today's panelists bring to our conversation experience, wisdom, and vision. Importantly, that last one, we are honored to have with us David Goodman. David Goodman is the vice chairman of the Andrew Goodman Foundation, AGF, and younger brother of Andrew Goodman. The AGF is named after Andrew Goodman, who was murdered in Mississippi on June 21st of 1964 by the Ku Klux Klan, along with two civil rights co-workers, James Chaney and Michael Schwerner. They were registering African Americans to vote in Mississippi. Today, AGF's vision is that young people will become active, engaged citizens who ensure a just democracy and sustainable future, and do this through AGF's mission of making young voices and votes a powerful force in democracy. Thanks, David, for being here. Judy Richardson was on SNCC staff from 1963 to 1966. She worked on all 14 hours of the seminal PBS series Eyes on the Prize and was its education director. She's produced numerous historical documentaries for PBS, the History Channel, and for museums. She's on the SNCC Legacy Project Board, working on their collaborations with Duke University, including the SNCC digital website, sncdigital.org, and on their continuing conversations with young activists. In 2021, she'll again co-direct a 3-week NEH Teacher Institute at Duke University on grassroots movement. And Ruby Nell Sales answered her call to social justice at Tuskegee University. As a teenager, she views her extensive civil rights, social justice, gender, and intergenerational work, that is all of it, as a calling rather than as a career. Dr. Sales received her BA degree from Manhattanville College and attended Princeton University for graduate studies in history. She received her Master of Divinity degree from the Episcopal Divinity School, where she was an Absalom Jones Scholar. Sales felt compelled to make a difference locally, nationally, and even globally. Through her hard work and dedication, she has been recognized with numerous awards and honorable mentions. As a social justice activist, Sales' work is cited in several books, journal articles, and films such as Taylor Branch's At Canaan's Edge, America in the King Years, 1965 to 1968. Broken Ground, a film on race relations in the South. Dan Rather's American Dream segment, and Blood Brother, Jonathan Daniels and His Sacrifice for Civil Rights by Rich and Sandra Nell Wallace. We hope she'll talk with us about that. After that, Sales founded, continues to direct a national nonprofit organization called Spirit House Project. Ruby Sales' dedication, intelligence, networking, and hard work established her as a renowned and respected public theologian, a writer, and social critic. Her interview with Krista Tippett, Where Does It Hurt?, draws on Black folk theology to set forth a radical language and paradigm that makes spirituality the heartbeat of social justice. Funded by the Duke Endowment, she is currently creating racial justice cafes in both North and South Carolina. Wow, what tremendous experience, talent, vision you all bring to this conversation. Thank you so much for being with us today. As we said before we were starting, we find ourselves in an incredible situation with so many moving parts. What we want to get from you today is an assessment of where we are, and most importantly, how we get out of where we are now. What are the steps forward? Ruby, why don't we start with you? I know that you often ask the question, where does it hurt? What answers are you getting now when you're asking that question? Where are we now?
Well, I think what people are beginning to understand is that when we deal with white supremacy in the 21st century, we must look at it as a cultural distortion and a spiritual malformation. And we must ask the fundamental question, how is it that we shift to culture rather than focus on people? And so that people are asking, understanding that means not only critiquing the world, but looking at the ways in which all of us, and most particularly white people who are carriers of white supremacy, how all of us have been marked by a culture of whiteness, and how do we exhibit those marks in our daily lives, and how we construct our work. And so the question, and so people really began to make a connection between where we are today as part of a larger narrative that began for African Americans from the point of enslavement, when we began to forge a freedom struggle that still exists today.
So, Judy, the culture of whiteness, and I know that you've been here before, the early civil rights days. I know that nothing that's happening now, or very few things, would surprise you. But how do you assess our current life?
Well, first of all, we have a really horrible man in the White House. And so the main thing for us is, how do we change that so that we can move forward and reimagine what we have to do next? I also think that, I'm really hopeful in terms of some of the young people. I just am amazed at particularly the young Black people, the young Asian people, the young Latinx people, the young white people who are out there. And not so much that they are, throwing the stones or painting the buildings, because that doesn't really get you anywhere. It's not functional. But I'm amazed at the fact that they understand that they have to have the networks and that they have to do something. And so that's really where I'm encouraged. And that they and that they understand that it's not just an individual police officer who hasn't had enough sensitivity training, right? They understand the systemic nature of white supremacy. And that's really given me hope.
Oh, hope. I love hearing that. There are so many people who are despairing. And certainly we've just recently lost Congressman John Lewis, who instructed us never to despair, that this work that we're doing is a life struggle. David, I know that you knew and worked with John Lewis. You were with him on the Pettus Bridge recently. Can you talk a little bit about where we are in this country?
In a way, I feel like we're back to the future, sort of 3.0. So Reconstruction was 1.0, civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s was 2.0. We're at 3.0. And we have to redefine terms. For example, murder used to mean you go to somebody with a gun and shoot him in the head or something like that. Today, murder, in my opinion, has to do with not affording or giving readily available health insurance to millions of people. And we all know that if you don't have health insurance, you're more likely to die prematurely. That's a form of state-sanctioned murder. And we have to redefine our terms so we understand what we have. Basically, we founded this country with this concept of money before people. Otherwise, slavery wouldn't happen. Money before people. And I've always been interested in the commercial world, the economic world. And I went to business school in 1969. This was 5 years after my brother was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. And that was a state-sanctioned extrajudicial termination. It was an assassination, just like Ruby experienced with Jonathan Daniels in front of her, okay? Murdered by police. So the stories are a little different, but spiritually the same. And it's the idea of a power structure who are concentrating money in a few hands and using every technique necessary to subject people of color, Latinx people today, because there weren't Latinx people 50 years ago, too many in this country, but it's a minority of some sort, a police state type mentality. So what do? I agree that I'm actually optimistic about the young people being aware of this history. We have 1.5 million students in our network.
Yeah,
and they're really doing wonderful things.
1.5 million, David. That's incredible. But as Judy mentioned, I think we need to be a little cautious about toppling the statues and the protests in the streets. And do you see the actual movement to real change? I know that in corporate America, people are running scared, making diversity moves and all of that. So in some sense, it seems that people are awake now. But are you confident that real change is here? That this is different from all of the other significant and major movements forward that seem to roll back where we would stall? Is this the big one? Judy, what do you think?
Well, it's interesting. I think you're doing it on a couple of different levels. So, for example, I live in the DC area. And so, yeah, it's fine to make the street in front of the White House Black Lives Matter Plaza. However, the same mayor who did that is also increasing the police budget. And so people can do superficial things like corporate America can, change the photo of Aunt Jemima. That doesn't do anything. They're doing easy fixes. And I think what a lot of the young people particularly, and some of the older folks like we are asking for is substantive change. And I think the folks who are in the street, not the ones who are, and let me just say, I don't mind people taking down Jeb Stuart and taking down, some statues need to be gone.
Right.
What I worry about is thinking that you have really made some change by doing it. So I think there are a number of folks whom we work with from the Movement for Black Lives who really are looking at how do you organize in your community, in your neighborhood, in your projects, and wherever you are to make it long-lasting change, not just so that you can go and do some quick demonstration.
Ruby, what about you in terms of I follow you on Facebook and I read your messages from the front porch. Sometimes they are not so cheery. So what are you saying at this point?
Well, I agree with Vincent Harding. We found hope in history, so I am hopeful. At the same time, I come out of a tradition where Black people were hopeful, but we were also pragmatic. So we came from a culture of pragmatic optimism, where we're able to look at the dreadful realities of white supremacy and all of its manifestations, but at the same time remain hopeful. And so that is the tradition that is a part of how I see the world. At the same time, I think it's really important for us to understand that this moment just did not happen. That it is the consequence of many actions that began with the Occupy Wall Street movement that dealt with the came about because of the Million Man March, that came about because of the war, of the movement against the war in Iraq. It came about because of the Women's March. There have been many dynamics that have led up to this moment, and historical moments don't just come out of nowhere. They're part of a historical flow. And that's why I say it's important for us to look at culture, because America has always been captured by two cultures. One culture flowed into the stream of fascism, which was a part of enslavement and Southern apartheid, and another culture tended to flow towards democracy. As imperfect as that stream was, the impulse was towards democracy. And we're involved in a struggle for which culture will define American society. And finally, that this is not a moment that just raises a question of what does this moment mean for Black people. It is also a moment that white people must ask the question, what does this moment mean for them in a world where 30% of white men own 95% of the wealth, and the rest of us have to share 5%. That means that whiteness does not carry the same currency that it once did. And so that we can deal with diminishing whiteness while simultaneously dealing with the fact that within this paradigm, Black people are the most oppressed. So those two things can happen at the same time.
David, what do you say? You mentioned the police and police states. What do you say when you see uniformed, although mysteriously uniformed, militia to some degree sent by the president into cities where people are protesting mostly peacefully, exercising their First Amendment rights? What do you say to that? How do we respond effectively to something like that happening in this country?
Well, there's a history, custom, and practice of police doing bad things. I think most police, real police people, want to do the right thing. But we have a president who is basically a failure, not competent, and is trying to, in my opinion, do things that he thinks will get him elected again, irrespective of who's hurt. But this is no different than the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and a state-sanctioned police state for African-American people since forever. It's just like I said, we need different words to describe the same thing. So we're in a Back to the Future frame that we have to understand historically. And my brother was murdered by police. And he was white, but he was allied with Black people who wanted to vote.
Right.
And the Ku Klux Klan couldn't stand most of the assets, want to suppress everybody else, need to, the structure is that way it is today. So we have to create a narrative that explains that and then take actions to counter it.
Speaking of Black people wanting to vote, Judy, voter suppression, another indication of where we are in this country. What do you say to young people who may be exercising their voting rights for the very first time or want to? What do we say to them as they see what seems to be widespread efforts to suppress their votes and every person of color's vote in the country?
I think what is good is that you see a lot of folks like Nsé Ufot, who's a fair fight, or Stacey Abrams through Georgia, New Georgia. I mean, actually, those are switched. And woke vote. There are just a lot of, particularly Black women, Black Southern women, who are doing this electoral vote work. And the main thing is not to be suckered by it, which is to say, okay, well, I know they're going to steal my vote, so I may as well not vote. That's ridiculous. Right. You know, that's like, I'm not going to go vote in 1960 because somebody's going to kill me. Well, yeah, they may. Hello. But the main point is, if you do nothing, then nothing changes. And I would suggest that as bad as Wallace was, as bad as Strom Thurmond was, nobody has been as bad as this man in this White House now, because he really is a sociopath. It has nothing to do with politics, right? So for him, it is, I will do whatever will make me look good. I will tell people not to wear masks. I will tell them to inject disinfectant. I will do whatever it takes to make me look good. That was a little different from somebody like Wallace, even different from the horrible man, McConnell, who has some policies. He's got to take the federal judiciary, whatever it takes, right? So for me, it is, don't go for what we used to call the okie doke. If you think, okay, my vote is not going to count, so therefore I will not vote, then the other side that wants you dead will win. And they would not be going through all this if the vote were not important. The great equalizer for us can be organizing, and organizing 3 people or 1,000. And the other great equalizer, if we use it, can be the vote. Because we don't have the money that the Koch brothers have, or that some of these horrible other people have. What we do have is our power to vote. And I think what we really have to do is make sure, as much as possible, like I'm in Maryland, that Governor Hogan, who says that he is, halfway liberal, he's saying, oh no, we're not going to have mail-in voters. Well, we've got to continue to pressure him to do mail-in votes.
David, what are you saying to you said 1.1 million young people who are engaged with you? What hopeful way forward are you saying to them now, and for all who are watching this?
Well, our mission is making young voices and votes a powerful force in democracy at the Andrew Goodman Foundation. We're nonpartisan, so we're not promoting a political party. And we try very hard to train a cohort of about 200 organizers who are peer-to-peer organizers. So I don't say anything to somebody who's, half a century younger than me. I let the young people deal with the young people and talk to them, but they have a program that we put in place that basically excites this age group around something that's important to them, and then draws a link between what's important to them and what's exciting them, whether it's negative or positive, and their power to vote. Gen Z and millennials are 40% of eligible voters, but the least likely age group to vote. Right. So they have to figure out on their own the power that they have. They have the power to decide everything. So we try to say that and then back off, because I'm too old to convince an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old what to do. But it has a tremendous impact.
Right, Ruby, we're gonna have you close us out and give us words of wisdom and inspiration for moving forward in these times. Preach.
Well, one of the things that I would say is that voting is part of a larger movement for African Americans. And I would put that within the context of a Black freedom movement that came into being the moment that Europeans put chains on African Americans. There were 2 issues that manifest itself still today. Black Lives Matter. We asserted that on those slave ships, that Black Lives Matter, and policing. Policing is not about a department, it's about a system that's tied into the managing and the containment and the constraints of Black freedom, because white people think that Black freedom poses a threat to white freedom. So for Black people, the question has always been a question of freedom, the ability to be free, the ability to move into our highest capacity, the ability to move freely in society without being murdered, the ability to participate in shaping the meaning of freedom in America by the right to vote. So I think that as we move into the 21st century, we've got to understand that Black Lives Matter is not a 20th century phenomenon or a 21st century one. It is as old as Black captivity and the Black freedom struggle in this country, because at the heart of the freedom struggle has always been the assertion, Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And you were all absolutely terrific. We want to thank our panel today, David Goodman, Judy Richardson, and Ruby Nell Sales, for dedicating their lives, for sharing their powerful and inspirational stories, and for their compassion and wisdom as we look to the future. Thanks so much for being
Thank you,
with us
Carol.
today.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Roy Paul. I'm joined with Keisha Ram, and we are two young people who ran for office. Keisha is currently running for office, but we wanted to talk to you a little bit about our experiences for the Race Rights, Righteous Anger, Redemption, and Hope Conference. So, Keisha, why don't you kind of start with a little bit about your background, how you decide to run at such a young age, and some of the experiences you faced?
Sure. Thank you, Roy. And it's really great to be here with Roy because we both started pretty young in politics. I live in the state of Vermont, so it's beautiful here, and I hope everybody's in a safe and comfortable place watching at home. So my name is Keisha Ram, and I started in the state legislature in Vermont when I was 22 years old. That means I ran my campaign at the age of 21, and I spent 8 years, pretty much my entire 20s, in the state legislature. I'm going back into the burning building, as they say now, hopefully. I'm in a state Senate primary, and that's for our county, Chittenden County. If elected, I would be the youngest woman in history and the first woman of color to serve in the Vermont State Senate.
Wow. And I similarly, I ran, I was, I think, 18 years old, and I was the youngest African-American in the state of New York, still is, to get elected to anything in the entire state. And I think it's been eye-opening, to say the least, with some of the things that I experienced. But I think what has been the most helpful is that sort of intergenerational support. I know, Keisha, you had a mentor, have a mentor that's been very supportive of you. Mine was Pat O'Dwyer, who's no longer with us, but always reminded me and other young people that they can get involved and not just, lick stamps, as she used to say, in the back closet, but you can actually put your name down and run. And she was very helpful with sort of demystifying some of the myths in politics. How has your mentor been influential for you?
So my mentor, who is like a grandmother to me, is Governor Madeline Kunin, our first and only female governor in Vermont and the fourth female governor in the country. I actually got to visit her yesterday. She can finally have visitors where she is now. And she's very well. She has a book of poetry coming out in the fall that she's been writing during the pandemic. So she stays really busy. And in fact, when I was 21 and running, that's when I met her. She has a visiting professorship at the University of Vermont where I was the student body president. And people said, that should be your first person you call on is Governor Kunin. And when I went to visit her in her office, she didn't let me forget some years later with poking me sort of in jest. I wore flip-flops and jeans and a hoodie to my meeting with her. And I still to this day don't know what I was thinking, but she was still very kind, gave me the kind of endorsement I needed to win against incumbents at the age of 21, and has continued to be a mentor through all my stages of life. Because one of the things we know well, Roy, is that you start out young, but you don't stay young. You need to buy a house and think about a family and, think about how to have your life advance in the public eye. And we need mentors who can help us make sure that we stay grounded as we do that.
Yeah, and as we sort of wrap up, I'm really optimistic, on the issue of hope. I'm hopeful because of the time that we're in and the examples that we see of people who are running and getting elected AOC, and she's also taken that mantle and supported other young people. What are you hopeful about?
I lost a race, right? I ran statewide at the age of 29 in 2016, and people said, this just seems a little bit much. You're so young, you need more experience. And now in 2020, people are saying, wow, you were right. We need to hand the mantle over, and we're glad you're back. We need people with energy. We need the combination of fresh ideas and experience. And, I think there is a lot of incredible intergenerational support that can be gained from folks saying, here's where we failed, and here's where we want young people to be successful. But I often say, especially when I'm talking to young people, I know that it sounds patronizing to say, hey, young people, you give us hope. Instead, I tell young people, you give me courage, because Gen Z is holding us accountable as millennials and holding everybody else accountable. And they're not satisfied with like a ping pong table at the office. They want equal pay. They want racial justice. And so more than hope, they give me courage. And I try whenever I can to tell them that.
All right. Sticking to time. That's a wrap, folks. Not just listen, but run. We need more young people to run.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Roy.
You got it.
Reverend Dr. Paul Smith has had a long and distinguished life. From civil rights work to creating multiracial churches in several cities, Dr. Smith has lived the change he wanted to see. Born and raised in South Bend, Indiana, he attended integrated public schools before enrolling in Talladega College, a historically Black college in Alabama. After graduation, he hosted a conference sponsored by Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, where he introduced Martin Luther King and Andrew Young to each other. The relationship with these two men had a profound influence on his life and led Dr. Smith to being involved in the Selma marches and forged a lifelong commitment to peaceful nonviolence and the liberation theology of Howard Thurman. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. And the question I would ask you—
You're welcome.
Is how that experience of putting together these two titans has really had an influence not only in your life, but most people would say it has had an influence on changing history.
Wow. Well, it certainly changed my life primarily because of Andy Young, more as a pastor getting involved in the movement. And then in terms of thought, of course, it's Dr. Howard Thurman, who has been I think I've patterned everything that I've done in my career, my ministerial career, after Fellowship Church, which Dr. Thurman created in San Francisco in 1939-40. Embedded in my DNA is Fellowship Church. So I knew that was possible. I knew if I kept that image of Fellowship Church, I would be on the right track.
I know that you have been a pioneer with really bringing reform to the presbytery in terms of LGBTQ issues. There are many people who call themselves evangelicals and who consider that they're following the teachings of Jesus Christ.
You know, I often say if I knew what I was doing, I could be dangerous. So you just have to be almost fearless. So we conquered, in a sense, the racial issue with regard to First Church. But once we really decided that we were going to be an inclusive church, and you remember at that time, the Presbyterian churches had mandated that we could not even talk about gay and lesbian people. It was against the Book of Order at that time. So I decided that I could not follow. I would follow the Book of Order, but I would not do that. I was not going to ask anybody about their sexuality and so forth. It's inconsistent with Scripture. Jesus would not do that, so therefore I'm not going to do that. So just so you know, First Church is an inclusive congregation. We practice it, we welcome it. So that's our stance, and we did it.
You mentioned authentic, and you're the subject of this book by Hildy Hendrickson, Listening for the Sound of the Genuine, Race, Religion, and Renewal in the Life of Reverend Dr. Paul Smith. What would you say, what's the final thing you would say to those who consider themselves Christians who are struggling with some of the issues that we mentioned earlier in this conversation?
Well, first of all, you as an individual, me as an individual, we know when we're authentic and we're not. We know when the sound of the genuine is coming from us. We can't fool ourselves. We think we can, but we can't. If I say I am really inclusive, that means everybody. It means that some things I thought I believed, I may have to change them, and I did. So when you are listening for the sound of the genuine, to me it means that I can be me without making it difficult for you to be you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'd like to thank Dr. Janet Bell for inviting my family to participate in this special program on the defining task of our time. As a human rights lawyer and law professor, I think about these issues all the time. But today I'd like to focus briefly on how my family's journey from Uganda to Australia and now to America informs our perspective on this task. So first, a super quick sketch of that journey. Our lives in Uganda during Idi Amin's brutal regime were precarious. But at the beginning of 1977, they were at stake, and we had to leave in a hurry. We could have come here, but Australia gave us a scholarship and opened earlier and welcomed us. Then in 1990, I was invited to spend a year as a visiting professor at Brooklyn School and asked to stay. So here we are. In Africa, the economy of race and racism was, of course, at the heart of colonialism and its brutality, apartheid, and even genocide. But these were external political regimes ruling over majority Black people, which is why they were eventually toppled. In America, the economy of race and racism was, of course, built on slavery. Slavery and its current shadow make racism much deeper and thoroughly systemic, deeply embedded in every aspect of life from cradle to grave. That understanding has in turn transformed our understanding of human rights violations in general as systemic. But I'll let my family add their thoughts.
Yeah, look, I personally, I won't pretend to offer any wisdom in the presence of my parents. But I think particularly in these, frankly, exhausting times we're living in, I know that I continually lean on our family story because, it's imbued me with a sense that, yes, we have to endure, and that takes a lot of energy, but we shouldn't forget to be intrepid in our endurance. And I think that's exactly what, your guys' trip from Uganda to Australia to the United States taught us. And so, all I can say is, all we can do is try not to get exhausted and forget about being intrepid because we're in desperate need of intrepid minds and bodies and hearts.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. And when I think about some of this topic, one, obviously, being part of the diaspora means we're not a monolith, and even though we aren't one, we all share the same experiences as Americans. And some of those are painful. I think, Dad, you and I were talking recently about an incident when I was a kid, and a student who I knew had gotten pulled off by the police for no reason, pulled off the bus. And you had said some really powerful words to me at that moment, along the effects of, that, fighting smart was important because deep down you knew there was no other alternative. And so that was painful and moving to hear after the fact. But also, I still remain very hopeful for a few reasons. One, I think the world is shrinking. Our generation are all, Dad, to use your phrase that I know you love, global citizens. And so they're going to be taking over leadership of this world. And that gives me hope. And then also cognitive dissonance. I mean, you can't know someone who is considered other, and then if you talk to them, really feel like they're other for too long. And so I remain hopeful about that. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is the death knell of closed-minded thinking. And those people are thrashing out and things like that. But I think their time is going to be up soon. And if a lot of them know that, and if they don't know that, they will soon.
Just watching the Black Lives Movement lately and listening to John Lewis's speeches and talks all over the place, I've been reminded about the wisdom of the elders, as Luke said. Those stories that we grew up with, family stories that we, the adults, owe to our children, we need to teach them, to tell them the stories and affirm them and tell them that they are worthy at home, at school, and at church, and in the community. I've also been reminded that really we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to go by, again, Lewis's words of hope, faith of optimism because the groundwork has already been done. There's Ruby Bridges, the civil rights movement leaders, the elected officials in government, the women in Congress, the marches, old, young, male, female, gay, and straight. We have something to work with, and we have our marching orders, and all we have to do is contribute our part, each one of us where we are with what we have been given.
Hello, we're talking with Tim Wise, who is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He has spent the last 25 years speaking in all 50 states to over 500 colleges and universities and to hundreds of professional conferences and community groups about systemic racism in America. He is the author of 8 books, including his forthcoming Dispatches from the Race War. His acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, is something that has been on our bookshelf, on our coffee table, and in our hearts for many years. It's a real pleasure to talk to you today, Tim Wise.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. I appreciate it.
I have a few questions to ask you. And the first question is, why anti-racism work? How did a nice guy like you get into this really tough work?
Well, I was raised right, I think. I'm a child of the South. I was born in 1968, raised in the 70s and 80s. And from a very early age, I was very fortunate to have parents, particularly a mother, who wanted to raise me in a way that she had not been raised, in a very intentionally integrated environment. I went to a historically Black college for preschool, actually, early childhood ed program at Tennessee State, where I was not only surrounded by, Black kids, but also by Black authority figures, Black women who ran that program, whose authority I learned to respect at the age of 3 and 4 years old in the early 1970s. And I think that what that did was, it was a real gift because it allowed me 20 some odd years later, when I was living in New Orleans, having gone to Tulane University and then going into community organizing, working with Black women in particular in those communities, to be able to hear what they had to say about their lives and what was going on, because I'd learned to trust Black authority 20 some odd years before, not to challenge it and to say, well, are you sure that what you're seeing is really what you're seeing? Maybe you're exaggerating. Maybe you're playing a race card. Maybe you're hallucinating, right? I was in a place to hear that because of the way that I was raised. And ultimately, though, I think what did it for me, what took it from a recognition to actual, life's work, was that around that same time in the early 90s, when I had graduated from college, is when David Duke, lifelong white supremacist, modern Nazi, former Klan leader, ran for U.S. Senate and governor in Louisiana. And I watched as 6 out of 10 white people, 675,000 white people in all, voted for a man they knew was a Nazi. It's not like they didn't know. Everybody knew. There were children in utero that knew that David Duke was a Nazi. That's how obvious it was, right? But 675,000 white people voted for him. And I realized after that I had work to do, that it wasn't about, saving Black folks. Black folks did the right thing. They saved us from David Duke. They went out and did what they had to do, as they have always done. But, nearly 750,000 white people voted for David Duke. And I realized that my job was to work with white folks, because I knew that there weren't 675,000 Nazis in Louisiana, but there were 675,000 white people so desperate for answers to whatever was going wrong in their lives that they were willing to blame Black folks and to vote for the guy who did that for them. I came from a family that they were not activists. They'd been a little bit too young to have been actively involved in the movement, though they had been supportive of it. My father, his parents were civil rights supporting parents. That's the Jewish side of my family. My grandfather had grown up in the Black community on Jefferson Street in Nashville and owned a business in North Nashville. And so I had been on that side of the family. There was never any question sort of how I would be raised. On my mother's side, a much more conservative side, she was the one that was sort of breaking with the tradition of her own parents.
People keep talking about this moment in time with the protests, with Black Lives Matter, with Black and white people marching together. Some of us recall that has happened before. So what is different about this moment? And is it sustainable?
Well, I think what's different is that we're in this coronavirus moment where you have millions of white people who, for the very first time, are experiencing a kind of vulnerability that frankly Black and brown folks have always experienced. I mean, Black and brown folks, it's not a pandemic question to say, is it safe to go to the store? Is it safe to go to the park? Is it safe to go for a jog around my neighborhood? Those are everyday Black questions, because we've seen what happened to Tamir Rice, John Crawford, Ahmaud Arbery. So for white folks, though, that's new. Like actually asking, is it safe to show up in this space, is something that most white folks haven't experienced. Now, obviously, some white women do because of the fear of sexual violence against them, LGBTQ folk, but most white folks haven't had that experience. So in this moment where millions of whites are suddenly feeling vulnerable, I'm not talking about the white folks who go to the Capitol with guns and camouflage, who clearly think that they're too big and bad to ever be felled by a virus, but average white folks really feeling for the first time vulnerability. And I think that has opened a pathway for empathy so that white folks can actually begin to hear and remember the last time their Black colleague, for instance, said that they didn't feel safe coming into a certain community, or they didn't feel safe in a given space, and maybe we ignored it before and we couldn't understand it. Maybe there's an opening now for that. There's also a recognition that the same people who are willing to roll the dice on Black life and gamble on Black life because they know that's who disproportionately is dying from this thing, those same people are willing to roll the dice on your white grandmother, on your white immunosuppressed child, on your white diabetic husband or wife, right? So I think there are millions of white folks right now who maybe you're beginning to feel and to hear. And then to see the killing of George Floyd brings into full and stark relief the stuff Black folks have been telling us for so long, which now, because of lockdown, we are in a position to actually feel and to see for the first time. At least I hope that's the opening, but we're going to have to take advantage of that because that window can just as easily close.
Mm-hmm. You've talked about the dangers that white folks need to avoid to really show up in this movement. Can you speak to that for the few moments we have left?
Sure. I mean, first is don't get distracted by the excitement of protest activity. Protest is very important. Demonstration is very important. But I'm afraid there are millions of white folks, and I've heard it to some extent, who say, gosh, this is like the 60s. And it's like, I'd always wished I was in the 60s. Well, that's not the motivation that you need to do this work. If you want to show up for racial justice, yeah, you should be in the streets when it calls for that, but you also got to do this work in your family. You got to do this work with your neighbors. You got to do this work on the job. You got to go into your kid's school and challenge the curriculum and the training that the teachers do or do not have. You got to do this when the cameras aren't on. And my fear is the danger is we get so caught up in the spectacle of protest activity and the spectacle of civil rights and anti-racism activity that we forget the hardest work is always the stuff that's going on behind the scenes that they did not teach you about in history class.
Well, we want to thank you for your comments and really appreciate your life's work. Thank you very much, Tim Wise.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sarah Esteban, and I'm a Program and Strategy Associate at one of the oldest nonprofits that works to defend and advance civil rights and civil liberties nationwide. I am also honored to be one of the board members for LEAD. As a young immigrant, my vision for the future is that our country strives for more than just a perfect union. Because when that was initially laid out, we the people did not mean all of us in the Constitution. Therefore, we should strive for a just and equal union wherein we stand with marginalized communities and in solidarity with Black lives. I believe that this can be achieved when we come together bringing about intergenerational solutions for social justice. Laws, politicians, and policies can only get us so far. In order to seize this moment with racial justice, despite the pandemic, we should turn this slacktivism wherein people repost, retweet, and post those Black squares on their Instagram, that kind of slacktivism, into something that changes hearts and mindsets, because a cultural shift is also necessary for implementing substantial and effective policy change. But we often live in echo chambers and in our social media, in our inner circles, and in our regions. So we must start with having uncomfortable conversations across generations and party lines. Lastly, as we are less than 100 days out until the election, I part with you with words from Octavia Butler. Choose your leaders with wisdom and forethought. To be led by a coward is to be controlled by all that the coward fears. To be led by a fool is to be led by the opportunists who control that fool. To be led by a liar is to ask to be told lies. Thank you.
Well, we have heard a diversity of voices and experiences as we explore today's topic, and it's a big one, as it should have been, and a terrific one. Race, riots, righteous anger, redemption, and hope, the intergenerational path forward. So it's not just us old folks, it's the young people. It's all of us moving forward together. Taj Brown, speaking of the young people, lead vice president and who is now programs and outreach vice president for LEAD, will share his observations and perspectives on what we've talked about in this program. Taj, what did you come away with?
Thank you, Ms. Jenkins. And, you know, what an incredible conversation this has been. I've been so inspired by all the experience and ideas about where we are and how to move forward. You know, I think that as we think about how to take all of this knowledge and these ideas and move them into action, a few key things stand out for me. Keisha and Roy talked about mentors, and I'm so grateful for all the mentors I've had through my work with the NAACP and in my communities that I've lived in. I think about how they talked about the power of Gen Z and the opportunity we have as Gen Xers to work with millennials to really strategize with and empower those Gen Z folks who are impressing us all and taking the world by storm. Tim Wise talked about facilitating what he called intentionally integrated environments. And he talked about how the vulnerability COVID presented can be an opening towards facilitating empathy with some of the folks on the other side. I think it was Derek Bell who said, education leads to enlightenment. Enlightenment opens up the pathway to empathy, and empathy foreshadows reform. And certainly, reform is what we need and aspire towards. I was particularly inspired, I'm always inspired by Judy Richardson when she talked about building networks and doing something. There are no easy fixes. That's something we hear from lots of the students who organized with SNCC and CORE in the 60s, the Charlie Cobbs, that we got to get busy being about the business of social justice. That's why LEAD is here now. We're here to frame these discussions so that we can learn from each other and craft solutions to the social, the political, and the moral challenges that are strikingly before us. But I think, Ms. Jenkins, that it's Ruby Sales and her discussion about white supremacy and the carriers of white supremacy, what I think she called today the dreadful realities of white supremacy and all of its manifestations, that gets my antennas all the way up. We must refuse subjugation. We have to reject the constraints to our freedoms, and we must promote resilience across the board. That, to me, is where the promise and the hope lies. We got to talk about this requisite narrative the media pimps about Black people being unfit, inappropriate, and unable to maintain ourselves. And those are the narratives that are used to justify the oppressive systems that we're tackling. So this has been phenomenal. As you can see, I'm inspired across the board today.
I can see, and I am so confident in the future, knowing that you are inspired and that you took note of all of those things that were said in this program and took them to heart. I want to ask you, as a young person, is there such a thing as righteous anger? You know, how do you define that?
Yeah, I do believe there's such a thing as righteous anger. And I think what we're seeing, the expressions across the country from coast to coast about Black Lives Mattering is, in fact, that righteous anger being manifested. I think the opportunity here that we have right now, it's an historic moment, is how do we maximize this energy, this interest, this enthusiasm around Black Lives Mattering to now achieve systemic social change, especially as it relates to direct social services and policymaking. Yes, statues are coming down, outstanding. Schools and football teams are being renamed, phenomenal. Baseball teams are kneeling across the country, love it. In Mississippi, a campaign we worked on for a long time in the NAACP in Mississippi, that flag has finally come down off the state house. That felt really good. But
took a long
how
time for that.
a long time. We worked so hard. But how are the children in the Jackson public schools faring? We're glad the flag is gone. But what is the impact of Black Lives Mattering in terms of policy? And I think that even as you think about social services, if Black Lives Matter, it has to be more than a yard sign and a perfectly crafted statement. I want to know, how many Black senior executives do you have? How many Black people are on your board of directors? And even as we think about Dr. King's beloved community, where we share in the wealth, how do we get Black Lives Matters into policy advances at every level? I think about Paulo Freire and his pedagogy of the oppressed, and how the answer to that from his perspective was to move towards an inclusive process that engages those we are serving as what I believe he called co-creators. I want to see this Black Lives Matter energy lead towards more of that.
So knowing, Taj, that this is in your hands, you know, the older generations are passing on the torches. We're keeping our lights. You know, we want you guys to have the full blast torches to make, you know, things happen. The last question: are you hopeful that you all can do it?
I am. I'm beyond hopeful. You know, I believed in my generation. I appreciate being recognized as young. I am 40, and we worked
that
so
is
hard.
Young.
I own it. Thank you. I feel young. But the way these Gen Zers are moving us forward, and you know, some people say audacity, some people say different words, but I think it's a positive thing. I have a lot of confidence in them, and I'm excited as we move this lead organization forward to engage them, not as subordinates and young people just to be mentored, but as those co-creators of those allies that we stand right beside and we learn from and we can be empowered by.
Well, Taj, thank you so much. Great observations, and I'm so glad you're hopeful. And you know, being mentored and now having mentees, and you know, together you will make a better world. Just know that we've done the best we could. We really tried, many of us.
Ms.
But
Jenkins,
just seeing,
you've done a phenomenal job. You in particular, because I know your story. I think about Ella Baker, right? Who says, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens." And I think that's where we are because of you.
we're together. We're all together on that point. I'm so glad you're in this, in the lead, and in this movement. Taj, thanks so much. And, you know, thanks to you all for being with us today. Our esteemed participants remind us that the struggle is for freedom, and that civil and human rights are a part of that greater struggle. To quote the late, great Maya Angelou, we know why the cage bird sings. That cage bird sings for freedom. Thank you for joining us for this program and continuing to struggle to make real the American ideal of democracy and justice for all. Thanks so much. I'm Carol Jenkins.
Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming, oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming, freedom is coming, freedom is coming, oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming, freedom is coming, freedom is coming, oh yes, I know.